Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Martin, and I am a PhD student at the University of Idaho studying rattlesnake human conflict in the central United States here in Wyoming. I'm really excited to chat a little bit about mitigation translocation, as well as some of the pitfalls of coexisting with venomous snakes. Human-wildlife conflict predates written language, and although we no longer have to contend with prehistoric bison, like the unfortunate man in this pictograph, Americans spend more than $22 billion every year mitigating conflict. From road traffic collisions to crop damage, these ongoing conflicts erode public perception of conservation and put animals at risk of extinction. The prairie rattlesnake, one of Wyoming's two native rattlesnakes, is the proverbial poster child for this type of conflict. This North American pit viper is known for its flashy defensive displays, its rattle, and of course its venom. However, the realized risk of death from a rattlesnake bite is extremely low in the United States. So, of the 2 to 3,000 people bitten by venomous snakes each year in the US, about 1 to 2 of those people die on average. So, you're about as likely to be killed by a falling coconut, and about 10 times more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to be killed by a venomous snake in the US. Despite this, people can be extremely fearful of rattlesnakes. Now, this is partially innate. We are born with an instinctive fear of snakes, but rampant misunderstandings about the behavior, ecology, and motives of rattlesnakes make people generally extremely intolerant of sharing space with these animals. And it's that fear primarily that drives high rates of conflict between humans and rattlesnakes. Historically, this fear has supported lethal removal and coordinated extirpation efforts enacted under the guise of public safety. Private and public bounties on rattlesnakes are still widespread. In 2016, this roundup in Sweetwater, Texas, collected, displayed, and killed more than 1,000 rattlesnakes during their annual festival. But rattlesnakes are valuable members of our ecosystems. Rattlesnakes are a critical food source for migrating raptors and mesocarnivores in otherwise depauperate landscapes. In addition, they exert top-down predation pressure on rodent populations, which supports native plant communities and eliminates disease reservoirs. And rattlesnakes are sensitive to disturbance. Lethal management produces population-level effects that could be a death sentence to sensitive species. Now, despite these benefits, the public may not always tolerate rattlesnakes in multiple use areas, such as campgrounds and hiking trails. They may chase or harass rattlesnakes, which in turn increases their risk of being bitten. In these situations, it's not always practical or safe to leave nuisance rattlesnakes in place. Mitigation translocation is commonly used to address this problem. The rattlesnake is removed, transported to a less populated area, and then released in a location with a lower risk of conflict. When it's done well, mitigation translocation has far-reaching positive effects. Not only does it save that individual animal, but it can also increase gene flow, augment struggling populations, and even help us establish new populations. For rattlesnakes, well-implemented mitigation translocation programs could be particularly valuable in terms of dealing with conflict. So these snakes are low energy specialists and they have a really limited capacity for dispersal. So this makes them susceptible to genetic isolation or bottlenecking that can occur in fragmented landscapes. But the outcomes of rattlesnake translocation programs are decidedly mixed. So when rattlesnakes are translocated within their home range, they often have high survival. Unfortunately, these animals also navigate their environment with a high level of proficiency. Um, and so they often return to their capture location. This can be totally fine if the snake is not detected or the primary issue is that someone was fearful, but it can result in multiple translocation attempts and resource expenditure if the area is simply not hospitable to rattlesnakes. Conversely, when rattlesnakes are translocated outside of their natural home range, they often suffer high mortality and altered movement behavior. Translocated snakes may move more frequently and they may travel further than non-translocated snakes. We're conducting research at a state park here in Wyoming that has been doing rattlesnake translocation for just over 4 years, 5 years. We have two objectives here. So, firstly, we're assessing the outcomes of translocation in the park. Secondly, we're assessing the mechanisms that underlie these outcomes so that we can create a generalizable framework that can be used to evaluate other translocation programs. Sinks Canyon State Park is a beautiful park. It has a sprawling south-facing slope, granitic rock formations, and of course, lots of prairie rattlesnakes. It's located in sort of south central Wyoming in the central United States. Um, and it's quite a destination for rock climbers, hikers, mountain bikers, all throughout the active season, which is from April to mid-October in this location. Rattlesnake conflict is highest in three areas of the park: Sawmill Campground, the Sinks to Rise Trail, which is a paved walking trail, and the Visitor Center complex. Rattlesnakes found in these areas by guests or park staff are collected and driven to the border of the park for release. Here's a look at that release area. So it's characterized by low sagebrush, woody vegetation, and rocky debris. The area is about 10 to 20 meters from the road, and it acts as this sort of central release location for nuisance rattlesnakes. Last year, we fitted 5 translocated rattlesnakes with implanted VHF transmitters. One came from the major roadway that bisects the park. 3 were collected from the Sinks to Rise Trail, and 1 was collected from the Papoja campground, which is a little bit on the sort of the far end of the park. Now, that last snake was the only one to be implicated in a bite incident, and a dog was struck but not envenomated. So translocation distance varied, but all of these translocations occurred outside the animal's presumed home range. So these are long distance translocations. Now, of these translocated snakes, we had 1 confirmed road mortality, as well as 2 failed transmitters, and then we had 2 snakes, a non-gravid female and an adult male, that successfully overwintered. Now, the snakes for which we lost their transmitters, they both had significant weight loss. One adult male lost 140 grams, and then the other, also an adult male, lost about 34 grams. This ranges from about 10% to about um, 33% of their body weight. So this is quite a significant weight loss for these animals. Now, before we dive into the rest of the results, I just want to go into our study design just a little bit. So we had a small sample size. We needed to be a little creative about accounting for the effects of age, size, sex, and capture location on movement behavior. The way we elected to do this was by conducting paired transmitter deployments. So when we translocated a rattlesnake from an area of conflict, we searched the surrounding landscape and collected an animal with similar characteristics. So if we had a large adult male, we would look for another large adult male. The nuisance rattlesnake was then translocated, and then the other animal was released at its capture site. So this gave us more of an apples to apples comparison with some of our movement metrics. You will also see some comparisons again of that movement data in the upcoming slides. And I just want to be clear that these data are always verified to the longest period of time that all animals in that comparison were active. Now, oops, the exception, of course, is this figure. So this just gives you an idea of what the non-translocated and the translocated snakes were up to. It's a little bit misleading because the translocated snakes here, we had more longer deployments on a lot of those transmitters than we did for our translocated snakes, but it's a cool bird's eye view of what these snakes were doing during the active season. And now here we are looking at this is 2 pairs of our matching snakes. So the 2 on the left are male, and then the 2 on the right are female. So this metrics, this is looking at total distance moved by each snake during the same time period. And you can see that this is sort of reinforcing what a lot of the literature suggests. These snakes were moving a lot following their translocation compared with non-translocated snakes. Look data are about a month and then about a month post. And you can see just that huge increase in both movement metrics, just moved, and then, which is really interesting. So just to kind of summarize these results a little further. So last year, our first year on the project, we saw increased mortality, we saw increased total distance moved, we saw larger activity range sizes for translocated snakes, about 3 times the normal activity range size. We saw a decrease in body condition, and then that non-gravid female that did survive over winter, she's reproducing this year, so she is gravid, but she has fewer follicles than we would anticipate based on solely her body length compared with other snakes. So all of this reinforces that in this area of protocol, translocation is really, really costly for these animals, not just from a survival outcome, but also looking at their movement behavior and sort of their prolonged fitness outcomes. We know any program are, it's time to get to work. So why are these animals not doing well, and what small manageable changes can the park staff make that better balances the snake's well-being with guests' enjoyment of the park? So we've generated a list of non-mutually exclusive hypotheses to explain why we may see decreased survival in translocated rattlesnakes. The first and maybe the most obvious has to do with that increased movement behavior. So searching may make translocated rattlesnakes more detectable to predators, more detectable to humans, and more susceptible to mortality as a result. Another alternative is that competition from resident snakes may exclude translocated rattlesnakes from necessary resources, things like overwintering locations, good foraging areas, mates, things like that. The other side of that coin is that we know rattlesnakes use conspecific trailing to locate resources. If a rattlesnake is translocated into an area without conspecifics, it may be limited in its ability to locate those resources on its own. Yet another alternative is that translocated snakes, for another reason, are not able to find or acquire sufficient food in an efficient way. So, unrelated to competitive exclusion or conspecific trailing, they're just not effective at finding the resources they need. Um, Another alternative is that if we release these animals into an area that simply doesn't have the resources needed to support a rattlesnake population, there's really no winning in that situation. And then lastly, there may be some stress accumulation. Translocation is stressful for these animals, and that certainly can predispose animals to sort of all-cause mortality. This year, we plan to manipulate translocation distance, and this will let us test predictions generated from each of these hypotheses so that we can make suggestions that address the root cause of poor translocation outcomes in sinks and areas like sinks. Um, to this end, we're going to be placing 30 to 40 additional transmitters. Um, and again, this will help us just construct a generalizable framework that helps us evaluate translocation programs in general. And with that, I'd like to thank Save the Snakes, the University of Idaho, the Museum of Southwestern Biology, NSF, and all of our other funders and collaborators, including Sinks Canyon State Park, Joe Ricketts, Jackson Fork Ranch, Wyoming Game and Fish, the Idaho chapter of the Wildlife Society, and my lab here at the University of Idaho.